On that particular Saturday when the plot of the thing began, if plots do begin in villages as abruptly as they do in books, the parish lawn at St. Mary Mead had been flung open to sunshine and chrysanthemums, their bold oranges and yellows thrust up from the borders, and there was a cheerful, municipal feeling to everything. Bunting, tablecloths pegged tightly against a fretful little wind, and clink of cups. The vicar spoke about community and puddings with a confidence he reserved for righteous causes, and Miss Marple, who had known puddings and communities both across a longer span than the vicar would in 3 lifetimes, listened and let her knitting needles click modestly on her lap. Miss Marple had selected a seat with some calculation. There is no advantage greater than a bit of shade and an all-round view on such afternoons. From under the wide brim of her straw hat, she could observe the queue at the jam stall, always revealing, and the comings and goings at the gate, where men of the parish affected nonchalance over the weight of plants in brown paper. Mrs. Emmeline Fawcett, the widow of 6 months, presided over the domestic produce section with a brisk pride. She was a little woman, compact, with a sharp profile and an air of having meant everything to be the way it was. The late Mr. Fawcett had been in import-export. "Tea, if you please," as Mrs. Price Ridley announced in a stage whisper to Miss Weatherby, and other things. One hears the word Malaya, don't one? And if the period of mourning had obliged Mrs. Fawcett to wear quieter hats, it had not restrained her energy, nor, seemingly, her cheerfulness. "A most fair mind," said Mrs. Dolly Weatherby, pausing beside Miss Marple's chair with the happy bustle of a robin. "Emmeline's given the blue ribbon to Mrs. Abbott's raspberry jam, in spite of those dreadful little pips. And do you know what that takes, Jane? It takes character." "It takes that you shouldn't bite down too hard," said Miss Marple mildly. "I do not say the pips aren't wholesome in their place." "Really, Jane, you do talk sometimes. Character, I said, and courage. She's had to do with a great many men. She understands them." Miss Marple glanced across the emerald lawn. Mrs. Fawcett, neat as a new pin, was pinning a ribbon with great attention to a jar of amber liquid. It wobbled delicately under her fingers. Her eyes, steady and brown, lifted for a moment towards the gate, where a tall young man with a city gloss, the kind that shows at the edge of the cuff where it is frayed, hesitated and then came boldly in. His hat was tilted. He had the air of someone who meant to be taller than he was. Basil Fawcett, the late Mr. Fawcett's son by a previous marriage, had kept St. Mary Mead interested for 3 weeks. He was seen rarely and never at convenient times. He wrote long letters in the public parlor of the Blue Boar, and he tipped, when he did tip, in a manner at once reckless and precise. Mrs. Fawcett's mouth tightened when she saw him, and Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, a small sound swallowed by the general conversation. The widow did not move from the jam jar. It was Basil who came to her, bowing, turning his hat in his hand, with an easy grace that would have charmed more than one woman present, if they had not already formed their opinions. "Mother," he began. He did not say it loudly, but there was an edge to the word. Miss Marple had often noticed how sons make a razor out of it when they wish to cut. "Basil." The widow's glance flicked to the ribbon again. "It is not the moment." "Moments," Basil said with a quick little smile, "are forever your enemies." Mrs. Dolly Weatherby, who felt life was a set of scenes arranged for her constitution, gasped in small pleasure at the word forever. She would tell several people later that Basil Fawcett had the manner of a poet. It would be Miss Hartnell's joy to contradict her with a firmness that increased as others agreed. After a minute, Basil had moved away, and the widow had resumed her rounds. Only Miss Marple noted the way Emmeline Fawcett's hand trembled slightly when she tied the ribbon on the last jar. Only Miss Marple saw, too, that on the key-ring which hung from the widow's belt, with all the utilitarian charm of a jailer's, there was a length of blue wool wound carefully round one key. It is astonishing how often a woman will keep a bad lock and forgive it, thought Miss Marple, because she has understood the habit of its difficulty. At a table near the shade, Irene Whitby, a thin, fair, long-necked woman of approximately 30, poured tea and wished separately that no one would speak to her, and that someone would speak to her kindly. She lived with Mrs. Fawcett as a companion and assistant, a word that included accounts, soup, and a great deal of listening. She watched Basil out of the corner of her eye, then looked down at the thinness of her own hands with a little shame, and added sugar to the vicar's cup as if it were a sin. Dr. Haydock, who adored good gossip as much as good health, stopped by Miss Marple and lowered his voice as if health were at stake. "Liver salts for half this parish, Miss Marple, and brandy for the other half. If we could persuade them to talk instead of ferment, we should all live to 100. "People will do just as they are made," said Miss Marple. "It is very foolish to expect them to be different." He followed her gaze to where Mrs. Fawcett, after her encounter with Basil, had put away her ribbon basket and was speaking now to Mr. Lionel Quayle, the postmaster. Mr. Quayle had once been handsome, and now expressed it in neatness. He nodded as she spoke, frowned, and took from her a sealed envelope with a certain reluctance. "Registered, then," he said, and he had the look of a man who would help anyone to post a letter if he wasn't sure of its contents. "There is not the slightest need for reluctance, Lionel," Emmeline returned in a tone that combed the words smooth. "It will be what it is." She turned then to make her farewells far earlier than such a thing warranted. "You'll manage the clearing up, Irene," she said, and from the youngest Miss Copley to Colonel Marchbanks, all heard the unlikeliness of a question in that sentence. "Griselda, dear, your cake has defeated 3 clergymen. It is a triumph for the laity." She took up her basket. No one offered to carry it. Emmeline Fawcett did not cultivate offers, and went out by the side gate that led through the red brick wall to the lane running down to Ivy Cottage. She walked briskly, a small figure against the hedge. Miss Marple watched her go and thought, with something like affection, that Mrs. Fawcett's shoulders had that set about them that meant a woman had not, perhaps, had things, but had managed them. By 6 o'clock the fete had declined into the melancholy of crumbs. The chrysanthemum cups had been won and were being discussed in precisely the quantities they were valued. Someone had mislaid a purse. Someone else had found it. The vicar had been made to accept a jar of mincemeat by Mrs. Bantry's cousin as a matter of righteousness, and it sat realistically heavy in his pocket with the weight of obligation. Miss Marple, who had been assisted into her coat by Irene with shy care, walked home with Mrs. Weatherby through the lane. There was a sense of soft deepening in the air. The hedges smelt of dust and mint and a little mushroom. Leaves had begun to gather in the corners like whispers. "It's the nicest sort of evening," said Mrs. Weatherby, because there was no effort in liking a thing that did not demand much. "I think we should— oh." The exclamation was whipped away by a sound that broke quite cleanly through the village air. There is a way a scream cuts, being very human and very simple. This one came from the direction of Ivy Cottage, a single, sharp cry, followed by an urgent, beating drumming that might have been rain if there had been a cloud. "Good gracious!" Mrs. Weatherby clutched at Miss Marple's sleeve, and then, like any decent person in St. Mary Mead, ran towards trouble. At Ivy Cottage there were already 3 people gathered. Lionel Quayle, the postmaster, who had a useful way with doors; Mrs. Larkins, who did for Mrs. Fawcett on Thursdays and had the colour of a boiled beetroot; and Edwin Larch, the new schoolmaster, who had a serious look and an awkward length to his limbs. All were looking at the front door, which is always a reasonable thing to do, since it sits there taking on responsibility. From within the house there was that pounding sound again, dull, insistent, and then a voice that was unmistakably Mrs. Fawcett's, sharp with terror in the way a practical voice is when panic has not had time to dress up. "Open the door! Open! Do you hear me? For pity's sake!" The chain rattled. The key scraped. "Mrs. Fawcett!" Mrs. Larkins cried, banging her small hands against the panel. "Mrs.? It's me, Larkins. Open the door." "It's chained," said Mr. Quayle uselessly, running a long finger along the edge. "It's a new chain," he added, in relief, as if someone should congratulate the village on its moderate crime rate. "Back," said Mr. Larch, attempting authority. He stooped, peering at the letter flap. It was the sort of flap that has seen a good deal of innocent paper pass through and is entirely unprepared for dramatic moments. "Mrs. Fawcett, can you hear me?" There was a dragging sound, then a small, thick noise that might have been a chair striking something, and after that, silence. It was a silence made of breath held, and birds stilling their throats, and the vague, decisive end of something. "We must get in," said Mrs. Weatherby faintly. "We really must, Mr. Quayle." "Lionel, do something." "P.C. Reeves," said Mr. Quayle with the correctness of a civil servant. "We must fetch—" But at that moment the village policeman came running from the farther end of the lane, breath going in a respectable manner. He was a good young man with a mother whose joints told her all about the weather. He took in the assembly, the door, the silence. "Right," said P.C. Reeves. "Mr. Quayle, if you'll just—" "No, Mrs. Larkins, as I say, no. Now then. Letter flap. Good. Mr. Larch, your penknife, if you please." It is astonishing how many serious young men carry penknives. It is one of the things that keeps England safe. Mr. Larch produced one. Reeves sank to his knees, threading the knife through the flap and, with it, a length of washing line that Mrs. Larkins, good domestic that she was, fetched without being asked. There was an awkward adeptness to it. Miss Marple, watching, thought of a girl she had known in service in Gloucester, poor Mabel, who had once locked herself out and had come in by a similar idea and the pantry window. People, Miss Marple reflected, repeat devices as they repeat mistakes. The chain lifted. The door pushed inward an inch, 2, and then, with a small wrench from Reeves, it opened fully. The hall beyond smelt faintly of beeswax and something else, an acrid little scent that might have been burnt sugar and might have been fear. "Stay out," said Reeves, but of course no one did. The parlour was a small, bright room that had been made obedient by Polish. On the mantelpiece something ticked and then stopped with a little capitulation. A chair had gone over. The tea tray on the table had 2 cups, one with a lipstick mark that was too honest to hide, the other untouched pale china mouth open as if surprised. There was a neat little heap of jam sandwiches one would have said were intended for a child, except that no child living in St. Mary Mead would have endured the crusts. On the hearthrug, her hand curved in a final tidy half-moon, lay Mrs. Emmeline Fawcett. Her eyes were open and indignant. It is curious how the face reveals in death the last thing it thought it ought to do. The front of her grey dress was crumpled. Her key-ring lay just beyond her fingers, the blue wool on one key grubby where it had rubbed. From somewhere deep in the house there was a slow drip, drip, and the clock on the mantel gave a single, belated tick like a cough. "Doctor," said Reeves, with a man's superstition about what doctors can do when they are minutes late. "Fetch, Miss Larkins. Run." "No need to run," said Dr. Haydock from the doorway. He had followed on Reeves' heels with professional inevitability. He dropped to his knees beside the body, his clever hands very gentle as he pressed fingers to a wrist he already knew was empty. He listened at a chest that did not trouble him. "She's gone," he said at last, with an ordinary sorrow. "A seizure, perhaps, or, well, we don't know yet." Miss Marple had not moved beyond the threshold of the parlour. She stood, light as a bird on the sill of a metaphor, and looked very simply at what was there. There was a smear of something reddish on the saucer beneath the untouched cup. She thought it was the merest suspicion of strawberry. There was the tiniest catch of silk in the hinge of the front door, some wisp that might once have been a scarf's edge, caught as if between impatience and closure. There was, too, an umbrella in the stand that had not belonged to Mrs. Fawcett. Miss Marple knew this because Mrs. Fawcett did not allow umbrellas that dripped in her hall, and this one had made a little print on the tiles. "Poor Emmeline," Miss Marple said to no one in particular, and her tone managed to be both gentle and exact. She was always so very tidy. Basil Fawcett arrived late, as people do who are worried and want to be seen worried. He pushed past Miss Hartnell, past the aspidistra, and went straight to the hearthrug with a cry that had the right shape and the wrong timing. Irene Whitby, pale as milk, had slipped quietly into a chair and folded her hands, as if she had only ever been waiting to fold them. Reeves drew himself up. "I'll be wanting statements," he said. "I don't say. Doctor, there's no mark." "No mark," said Haydock, but he did not sound entirely pleased. "No mark at all, which, well, we shall see." "Then it was her heart," said Mrs. Larkins with finality, because hearts are the things one blames when one has never been allowed to blame anyone else. Outside, the village had begun to gather, because villages do not need bells to call them. A whisper went along the lane like wind through long grass. Mrs. Fawcett, at her door, screaming to be let out. Dead. How dreadful. Basil, Irene, a letter at the post. A chain newly put in. Miss Marple listened to the whisper, and to the drip in the quiet house, and to the faint, cloying sweetness of strawberry on the air, and she did not knit because she did not need her needles when people were speaking. She looked at the 2 cups on the tray and thought, as faintly as the ticking clock behind the heavy silence, of another village long ago, where a girl had for the first time been allowed to pour the tea for a gentleman and had been too nervous to remember that gentlemen notice very little and that women notice everything. "Miss Marple," said Mrs. Weatherby in a small, urgent voice at her elbow. Do you think she knew who she was afraid of?" Miss Marple's eyes, which had been resting on the blue wool wound carefully about the large brass key, came back with a tiny, wry light in them. "My dear," she said very softly, "people are most often afraid of what they ought to know and pretend they do not." In the doorway, the chain on the front door swung faintly, as if, a minute before, it had been employed by hands with a tidy habit. P.C. Reeves, with the particular solemnity that comes to young men when they find themselves responsible for more than they had bargained for, began the delicate task of managing both the scene and the village's insatiable curiosity. He positioned himself in the cottage doorway with the air of someone who understood that authority, however modest, must be exercised with visible confidence, even when one's knees felt rather less steady than one might wish. "If I might ask everyone to step back just a bit," he said, his voice carrying the careful politeness that marked him as a man who knew his neighbors would be discussing his handling of this matter for months to come. "Inspector Crispin from Much Benham will be along presently, and will want to keep things just as they are until then." The crowd, which had swelled to include most of the village's more mobile residents, arranged itself into a respectful semicircle around the cottage gate. Mrs. Price Ridley had somehow managed to secure the most advantageous position from which she could observe both the official proceedings and the reactions of her fellow villagers with equal attention. Her voice, pitched at that particular level which suggests confidentiality while ensuring maximum distribution, reached every ear within 50 yards. "I always said there was something not quite right about that household," she announced to Miss Weatherby, who nodded with the mechanical agreement of someone who had learned that contradiction only prolonged such conversations. "A widow of 6 months, mind you, and that stepson of hers hanging about with his London ways. Mark my words, there's more to this than meets the eye." Miss Marple, who had taken up a position near the garden gate where the late roses still provided both shade and an excellent view of the proceedings, observed the gathering with the quiet attention of someone who understood that human behavior in crisis often revealed more than any amount of deliberate questioning. Her knitting needles moved with their customary rhythm, but her eyes missed nothing of the small dramas unfolding around her. Basil Fawcett had remained near the cottage door, his grief having settled into the sort of dignified sorrow that suggested considerable practice in managing his public persona. When P.C. Reeves approached him with notebook in hand, Basil straightened his shoulders and assumed an expression of cooperative melancholy that would have been entirely convincing if Miss Marple had not noticed the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his cigarette case. "If you wouldn't mind, sir," Reeves began with careful formality, "I'll need to ask you a few questions about this afternoon. Just routine, you understand." "Of course, Constable," Basil replied, his voice carrying just the right note of dignified grief. "Anything I can do to help understand this terrible tragedy." He paused to light his cigarette with fingers that were not quite steady. "Though I'm afraid I can't tell you much. I only arrived at the cottage a few minutes before we heard the screaming." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, as she noted the slight hesitation before the word screaming, as if Basil were testing how it sounded in his own mouth. She had observed over many years that people who were genuinely shocked by unexpected events rarely needed to rehearse their reactions to them. "And before that, sir, you were at the church fete, I understand?" "Briefly, yes. I spoke with my stepmother at her stall." Basil's eyes flickered toward the cottage windows, then back to Reeves. "She seemed, well, perhaps a bit agitated. Family matters, you understand. Nothing that would suggest—" He gestured helplessly toward the cottage door. Dr. Haydock emerged from the cottage at that moment, his medical bag in hand and a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. He paused to speak quietly with P.C. Reeves, and Miss Marple observed that whatever he said caused the young constable's expression to shift from the satisfied look of a man dealing with a straightforward natural death to something considerably more uncertain. "No obvious cause," she heard the doctor murmur, his voice pitched low but not quite low enough to escape her sharp hearing. "No marks, no signs of violence, but the circumstances—" He shook his head slightly. "Most peculiar. A woman doesn't usually chain herself in and then scream to be let out. And there are one or two things that don't quite fit." The arrival of Inspector Crispin from Much Benham brought a new energy to the proceedings. He was a small, neat man with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with rural mysteries that usually prove to have disappointingly mundane explanations. He conferred briefly with Dr. Haydock and P.C. Reeves before disappearing into the cottage, emerging some 20 minutes later with an expression that suggested his expectations of a simple case had been considerably revised. "Right then," he announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. "I'll be wanting to speak with anyone who saw Mrs. Fawcett today, particularly this afternoon after the church fete. Mr. Fawcett, if you'd be so good as to step inside, we'll start with you." As Basil followed the inspector into the cottage, Miss Marple noticed Irene Whitby, who had been standing quietly near the kitchen door throughout the proceedings. The young woman's face was pale as milk, and her hands were clasped so tightly together that the knuckles showed white. When she caught Miss Marple's gentle gaze upon her, she flushed deeply and looked away, as if kindness were somehow more threatening than suspicion. Mrs. Bantry, who had arrived with her customary briskness and immediately taken charge of organizing the more excitable villagers into some semblance of order, approached Miss Marple with the air of someone seeking sensible conversation in a sea of speculation. "Most peculiar business, Jane," she said, settling herself on the garden bench with the authority of someone who intended to remain until all mysteries were satisfactorily resolved. Emmeline was not the sort of woman to have hysterics over a locked door. She was far too practical for such nonsense. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting to the cottage windows where Inspector Crispin could be seen in animated conversation with Basil Fawcett. "And yet she did scream, didn't she? Most urgently, from what Mrs. Weatherby tells me. One wonders what could have frightened such a sensible woman so very badly." Through the parlor window, they could observe the interview in progress. Basil sat with his back straight and his hands folded in his lap, the picture of cooperative grief, but there was something in his posture that suggested considerable inattention. Inspector Crispin paced back and forth, occasionally pausing to examine some object or to ask a question that caused Basil to shift uncomfortably in his chair. The chain on the door, Mrs. Bantry continued thoughtfully, was fitted only last month, according to Mrs. Larkins. Emmeline was quite particular about security after that business with the tramp last spring. But to chain herself in and then be unable to get out, she shook her head. It doesn't make sense. Miss Marple's attention was caught by a small detail that others seemed to have overlooked. Near the cottage door, partially hidden by the climbing rose, was a lady's umbrella, a rather elegant one with a mother-of-pearl handle. It was quite wet, despite the fact that there had been no rain for several days. She made a mental note to mention this to Inspector Crispin when the opportunity arose. The sound of raised voices from within the cottage drew their attention back to the official proceedings. Through the window, they could see that Inspector Crispin had risen from his chair and was gesturing emphatically, while Basil Fawcett remained seated but had adopted a more defensive posture. The interview was clearly not proceeding as smoothly as either party had hoped. As the afternoon wore on, the village gradually began to disperse, though most lingered within earshot, unwilling to miss any potential revelations. Miss Marple remained at her post by the garden gate, her knitting providing the perfect cover for continued observation. She had learned long ago that elderly ladies with needlework were rendered virtually invisible in most social situations, a phenomenon that had proved remarkably useful over the years. When Inspector Crispin finally emerged from the cottage, his expression suggested a man who had discovered that his simple case was proving rather more complicated than anticipated. He was followed by Basil Fawcett, whose face was flushed with what appeared to be anger rather than grief. The two men stood for a moment on the doorstep, their conversation continuing in voices too low for the assembled crowd to overhear, but their postures spoke of fundamental disagreement about something of considerable importance. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the moment when Basil's composure finally cracked. His hands, which had been clenched at his sides, suddenly relaxed, and he ran one through his hair in a gesture of defeat or desperation. Whatever Inspector Crispin had said to him had clearly struck home, and for just an instant the mask of grief slipped to reveal something much more complex and considerably more interesting beneath. As the shadows lengthened and the first lamps began to flicker on in cottage windows throughout the village, Miss Marple reflected on the curious collection of details that had emerged from this tragic afternoon. The mysterious umbrella, the registered letter to the solicitors in Much Benham that Mrs. Fawcett had been so insistent upon posting, the two teacups in the parlour with their telltale evidence of an interrupted social call, and above all, the question of how a woman could lock herself in her own home and then be unable to get out. These were the sorts of small inconsistencies that, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, often proved to be the loose threads that, when pulled gently but persistently, could unravel even the most carefully woven deception. The village would sleep uneasily tonight, she suspected, and tomorrow would bring fresh revelations that might cast this afternoon's tragedy in an entirely different light. Inspector Crispin, having established that the cottage must remain undisturbed until a more thorough examination could be conducted, began his methodical review of the scene with the particular attention of a man who had learned that rural mysteries often hinged on the smallest domestic details. He moved through the parlour with careful deliberation, his trained eye cataloguing each element that seemed even slightly out of place in what had clearly been Mrs. Fawcett's precisely ordered domain. The elegant umbrella by the door drew his immediate attention. It was a lady's umbrella, certainly, with a mother-of-pearl handle that spoke of quality and expense, but it was thoroughly wet despite the fact that there had been no rain for several days. More curious still, it was not the sort of practical, serviceable umbrella that would have suited Mrs. Fawcett's sensible nature. When he questioned P.C. Reeves about it, the young constable confirmed that it had not been there during his initial examination of the scene. "Whose is this, then?" Inspector Crispin asked, lifting the umbrella carefully with his handkerchief. The assembled villagers still clustered around the garden gate, despite his earlier requests for them to disperse, offered the usual chorus of negative responses that such objects inevitably provoke in small communities. Miss Marple, observing from her position near the climbing roses, noted that Irene Whitby's face had gone even paler at the sight of the umbrella, though the young woman quickly looked away when she noticed the inspector's attention upon her. There was something about Miss Whitby's reaction that suggested recognition rather than mere nervousness, though she remained silent when directly questioned about the object. The tea service in the parlor told its own story to those who knew how to read such domestic narratives. 2 cups had been set out, but only one showed signs of use. Mrs. Fawcett's cup bore the telltale mark of her lipstick, a practical shade that matched her no-nonsense approach to personal grooming. The second cup remained pristine, though Inspector Crispin noticed a faint smear of what appeared to be strawberry preserve on the saucer beneath it, as if someone had been offered refreshment but had departed before partaking. She was expecting someone, Dr. Haydock observed quietly, joining the inspector in his examination of the scene. Or someone called unexpectedly. Either way, they left rather abruptly. The key ring that had fallen near Mrs. Fawcett's body provided another piece of the puzzle. Inspector Crispin examined it carefully, noting the length of blue wool wound around one particular key. When questioned, Mrs. Larkins explained that this had been Mrs. Fawcett's method of identifying the troublesome scullery door key, which had a habit of sticking and required a particular technique to operate effectively. "She was always fussing with that lock," Mrs. Larkins explained, wringing her hands. "Said it was more trouble than it was worth, but she wouldn't have it replaced. 'Waste not, want not,' she always said. The blue wool was her way of marking it so she wouldn't waste time trying the wrong key." This detail seemed to particularly interest Inspector Crispin, who spent several minutes examining the scullery door and its recalcitrant lock. Miss Marple, watching from outside, observed that he paid special attention to the door frame and the small window above the sink, which appeared to be slightly ajar despite the evening chill. When Inspector Crispin finally called for Miss Whitby to be interviewed, the young woman approached the cottage with the reluctant steps of someone walking to an execution. She had been waiting by the kitchen garden, her thin hands smoothing, her dark skirt with nervous repetition, and her face bore the pale, drawn expression of someone who had spent a sleepless night contemplating unpleasant possibilities. The interview, conducted in the same parlor where Mrs. Fawcett had met her end, proved to be far more revealing than Inspector Crispin had initially expected. Miss Whitby perched on the edge of her chair as if prepared for immediate flight, her responses initially consisting of barely audible confirmations of the day's routine events. But when the inspector began questioning her about Mrs. Fawcett's recent correspondence and any unusual visitors to the cottage, the young woman's composure began to crack visibly. "The registered letter," Inspector Crispin said, consulting his notebook. "Mrs. Fawcett was quite insistent about posting it yesterday afternoon. Do you know what it concerned?" Miss Whitby's hands, which had been clasped tightly in her lap, began to tremble noticeably. I don't know. Mrs. Fawcett didn't discuss her private business with me. She was very particular about such things. But you must have some idea. As her companion and assistant, surely you helped with correspondence." "Sometimes," Miss Whitby admitted reluctantly. "But this was different. She wrote it herself in her bedroom with the door closed. She said it was a matter that required discretion." Inspector Crispin's attention sharpened at this admission. He rose from his chair and moved to the mantelpiece, where Mrs. Fawcett's collection of small ornaments sat in their customary precise arrangement. Among them, partially hidden behind a china shepherdess, was a small silver frame that had been turned face down. When he lifted it and turned it over, Miss Whitby gave an involuntary gasp. The photograph showed a young woman in an elegant dress, her dark hair styled in the fashion of several years past. She bore a striking resemblance to Miss Whitby, though the woman in the photograph had an air of confidence and prosperity that the current Miss Whitby notably lacked. "Do you recognize this photograph, Miss Whitby?" Inspector Crispin asked gently, though his eyes remained sharp and assessing. Miss Whitby's face had gone from pale to ashen, and she pressed one hand to her throat in a gesture of genuine distress. Yes, that's my sister, Margaret. She died 3 years ago." "Your sister?" the inspector repeated, making a note. "And was Mrs. Fawcett acquainted with her?" The question seemed to strike Miss Whitby like a physical blow. She half rose from her chair, one hand extended as if to snatch the photograph away, before catching herself and sinking back with visible effort. They knew each other. Briefly. It was a long time ago. Outside the cottage, the assembled villagers watched this exchange with the fascinated attention of an audience at a particularly gripping theatrical performance. Miss Marple, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm, observed that whatever Inspector Crispin had discovered had transformed the interview from routine questioning into something approaching an interrogation. The remainder of the interview proceeded with Miss Whitby in a state of barely controlled agitation. Her responses became more animated, though whether from distress or defiance was difficult to determine. Inspector Crispin pressed her for details about her sister's relationship with Mrs. Fawcett, the circumstances of her sister's death, and her own arrival at Ivy Cottage as Mrs. Fawcett's companion. Each question seemed to increase Miss Whitby's distress, and by the time the interview concluded, she appeared to have aged several years. When Miss Whitby finally emerged from the cottage, she looked as though she had endured a severe ordeal. Her face was blotchy with suppressed tears, and she walked with the unsteady gait of someone who had received a profound shock. Mrs. Larkins, with the practical kindness of a woman accustomed to managing domestic crises, immediately took charge of the situation. "Come along, dear," she said firmly, taking Miss Whitby's arm. "You'll stay with me tonight. No sense in you being alone after such a terrible day." As the two women made their way down the lane, Miss Marple noticed that Miss Whitby kept glancing back at the cottage with an expression that mingled fear with something that might have been regret. It was not the backward look of someone leaving a scene of tragedy, but rather the furtive glance of someone who had left something important behind and was uncertain whether she would have another opportunity to retrieve it. The evening gradually settled into the particular quiet that follows dramatic events in small communities. Inspector Crispin secured the cottage and arranged for P.C. Reeves to maintain his vigil through the night while the villagers slowly dispersed to their homes, carrying with them enough material for weeks of speculation and discussion. Sunday morning arrived with the clear, bright quality that seems to mock human troubles with its cheerful indifference. The church bells rang as they always did, calling the faithful to worship, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air that even the familiar rituals could not entirely dispel. The congregation that assembled in St. Mary Mead's ancient church was larger than usual, drawn as much by curiosity as by devotion. Miss Marple, taking her customary place in the third pew, observed the subtle dynamics of village society adjusting to accommodate the previous day's shocking events. Irene Whitby, pale but composed, sat with Mrs. Larkins in the middle of the church, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed steadily on the altar as if seeking sanctuary in familiar forms. Basil Fawcett arrived late, as was his habit, and took a place at the back where his presence could be noted, but where he would not be required to engage in the sort of social interaction that his current circumstances made awkward. The vicar's sermon on the fragility of human existence seemed particularly apt, though Miss Marple found herself paying more attention to the congregation's reactions than to the theological content. Mrs. Price Ridley dabbed at her eyes with theatrical precision, while Mrs. Weatherby appeared genuinely distressed by the reminder of mortality. Most interesting to Miss Marple was the way Basil Fawcett's eyes kept drifting toward Miss Whitby, as if he were trying to catch her attention for some purpose of his own. After the service, the churchyard became an informal forum for the exchange of theories and speculation about Mrs. Fawcett's mysterious death. Mrs. Larkins, who had been with the deceased woman longer than anyone else, found herself the center of considerable attention as people sought details about her employer's final days. She'd been nervous all week, Mrs. Larkins confided to a small group that included Miss Marple. Kept checking the locks, counting her keys, making sure everything was secure. Said something about expecting a visitor, though she wouldn't say who. And that registered letter she was so determined to post yesterday? She'd been working on it for days, writing and rewriting until she was satisfied with every word. Did she mention the nature of her business with the solicitors? Miss Marple inquired gently, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Mrs. Larkins shook her head. Mrs. Fawcett was not one to discuss her private affairs, even with those who worked for her. But I did notice she'd been going through old papers lately, sorting through things that had been put away for years. There was a box of letters in her bedroom that she'd taken out of storage. Some of them looked quite old. This information seemed to confirm Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the true nature of the tragedy at Ivy Cottage. In her considerable experience, people who spent their final days sorting through old correspondence and writing urgent letters to solicitors were usually dealing with matters that went far beyond routine estate planning. There were secrets in Mrs. Fawcett's past, secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. As the morning progressed and the village gradually returned to its Sunday routine, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the pattern of small details that had emerged from the previous day's events. The wet umbrella that didn't belong to Mrs. Fawcett, the untouched teacup that suggested an interrupted social call, the photograph of Miss Whitby's sister hidden on the mantelpiece, and the registered letter that had been posted with such urgency. Each element seemed to point toward a complex web of relationships and hidden motives that went far beyond the simple domestic tragedy it had initially appeared to be. The truth, Miss Marple reflected as she made her way home through the quiet village streets, was probably hiding in plain sight among these seemingly innocent details. In her experience, the most carefully planned crimes often left the most obvious clues, precisely because the perpetrators were so focused on the dramatic elements of their schemes that they overlooked the small domestic details that ultimately betrayed them. The challenge, as always, would be to see past the obvious explanations and recognize the true significance of what had really happened at Ivy Cottage on that fateful Saturday afternoon. The Monday morning that followed brought Inspector Crispin back to St. Mary Mead with the brisk efficiency of a man who had spent a sleepless night considering the curious inconsistencies that had emerged from what should have been a straightforward case of natural death. The village, having absorbed the initial shock of Mrs. Fawcett's demise, had settled into that particular state of heightened awareness that accompanies unexplained tragedy in small communities, where every conversation carried the weight of potential revelation and every glance might conceal significant knowledge. Miss Marple, who had risen early with the deliberate purpose of tending her garden border that ran conveniently along the lane to Ivy Cottage, observed the inspector's arrival with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose expectations were being methodically confirmed. She had spent the previous evening in careful consideration of the small details that others had overlooked, and the pattern that was emerging suggested complexities that went far beyond the apparent simplicity of a widow's sudden death in her own parlor. Inspector Crispin's first destination was the village post office, where Mr. Lionel Quayle awaited him with the nervous precision of a man who understood that his role in the previous day's events had acquired unexpected significance. The postmaster's confirmation of the registered letter's details provided the first substantial clue to Mrs. Fawcett's state of mind in her final hours. Messrs. Grimshaw and Sons, solicitors, Much Benham, Mr. Quayle reported, consulting his meticulously maintained records. Mrs. Fawcett was most particular about the timing, Inspector. said it must reach Mr. Grimshaw personally by Monday morning. No delays permitted. She paid extra for special delivery and watched me frank it with her own eyes. The urgency that Mrs. Fawcett had attached to this correspondence suggested matters of considerable importance, and Inspector Crispin made immediate arrangements to travel to Much Benham that afternoon. In his experience, people who dispatched urgent letters to solicitors on Saturday afternoons were usually dealing with affairs that could not wait for normal business hours, and such affairs often provided excellent motives for the sort of desperate actions that led to tragedy. The mysterious umbrella continued to perplex the investigation, its elegant mother-of-pearl handle and thoroughly wet condition on a rainless day, marking it as an anomaly that demanded explanation. When Inspector Crispin called again at Mrs. Larkins's cottage to question Miss Whitby about this curious object, he observed that the young woman's composure, already fragile, showed signs of further deterioration. Miss Whitby sat by Mrs. Larkins's cheerful fire, her hands working mechanically at a piece of mending that seemed to require far more attention than its simple nature warranted. When Inspector Crispin produced the umbrella, her reaction was immediate and telling. A sharp intake of breath followed by a visible struggle to maintain her composure. "This rather fine article was found at Ivy Cottage," Inspector Crispin said gently, noting the way Miss Whitby's eyes fixed upon the handle with unmistakable recognition. "I don't suppose you can tell me how it came to be there?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge that Miss Whitby was clearly unprepared to meet. Her pale face flushed, then drained of color entirely, and she pressed one trembling hand to her throat in a gesture of genuine distress. It belonged to my sister," she whispered finally, the admission seeming to cost her considerable effort. "To Margaret, but she's been dead these 3 years." This revelation transformed the umbrella from a simple mystery into evidence of connections that reached back into the past, linking Mrs. Fawcett's death to events that had occurred long before the previous Saturday's tragedy. Inspector Crispin pressed gently for details, and gradually the story emerged of Margaret Whitby's employment in Mr. Fawcett's business offices, her relationship with the family, and the circumstances of her untimely death by drowning in the millstream below Much Benham. "Mrs. Fawcett kept some of Margaret's things," Miss Whitby explained, her voice barely audible above the crackling of Mrs. Larkins's fire. "She said it was proper to remember the dead, even when there had been difficulties between them. The umbrella was in a box in her bedroom, along with letters and photographs. I never understood why she kept them." The afternoon's journey to Much Benham provided Inspector Crispin with revelations that cast the entire case in a dramatically different light. The registered letter, when examined at Grimshaw and Sons offices, proved to contain instructions for a complete revision of Mrs. Fawcett's will, with terms that would have disinherited Basil Fawcett entirely in favor of a distant cousin who had not been in contact with the family for decades. The letter also contained urgent requests for investigation into certain property documents related to Mr. Fawcett's business interests in Malaya, suggesting that Mrs. Fawcett had discovered irregularities that required legal attention. Mr. Grimshaw, an elderly gentleman whose practice had served the county's established families for 40 years, confirmed that Mrs. Fawcett had been increasingly concerned about her stepson's financial management and had hinted at discoveries that had shaken her confidence in his integrity. The proposed new will would have left Basil with only a modest annuity, while the bulk of the estate, including Ivy Cottage and the Malayan properties, would have passed to beneficiaries who had played no role in the family's recent troubles. When Inspector Crispin returned to St. Mary Mead that evening, he carried with him not only the evidence of Basil's powerful motive for preventing his stepmother's legal actions, but also a small silver locket that had been found tucked beneath a cushion in the cottage parlor. The locket, when opened, revealed 2 faded photographs, one of a younger Mrs. Fawcett and another that was unmistakably Margaret Whitby, Irene's deceased sister. Miss Marple, who encountered Inspector Crispin as he made his way through the village, observed that his expression carried the particular satisfaction of a man who had found significant pieces of a complex puzzle, though the overall picture remained frustratingly incomplete. When he showed her the locket, her reaction was characteristically thoughtful. "How very interesting," she murmured, examining the delicate silver work with gentle fingers. One wonders how long Mrs. Fawcett had been carrying this particular burden. People do keep the strangest mementos, don't they, Inspector? Usually because they represent either great happiness or great guilt. The implications of the locket's presence at Ivy Cottage, combined with the umbrella that had belonged to Margaret Whitby, suggested connections between past and present that went far beyond the obvious financial motives surrounding the proposed will. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the various ways that secrets from the past could reach into the present, creating pressures that eventually demanded resolution through desperate actions. As evening settled over the village, the investigation had clearly moved beyond the simple tragedy it had initially appeared to be. The evidence now pointed toward a complex web of family relationships, financial irregularities, and hidden guilt that had finally reached a crisis point in Mrs. Fawcett's parlor on that fatal Saturday afternoon. Someone among the small circle of people who had access to Ivy Cottage possessed knowledge that they were willing to kill to protect, and that someone had been clever enough to make murder appear like natural death in a locked room. The challenge now facing Inspector Crispin was to determine which of the several compelling motives had actually driven someone to take Mrs. Fawcett's life, and more importantly, how they had managed to accomplish the seemingly impossible task of committing murder in a room that had been chained shut from the inside. Miss Marple, reviewing the day's revelations from her comfortable sitting room, felt the familiar stirring of intellectual curiosity that always accompanied the recognition that human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, was about to reveal itself through the careful examination of seemingly innocent domestic details. The Tuesday morning that followed brought Inspector Crispin back to St. Mary Mead with the methodical determination of a man who had spent a restless night considering the curious inconsistencies that refused to resolve themselves into a coherent pattern. The village, having absorbed the initial shock of Mrs. Fawcett's death, had settled into that particular state of heightened awareness that accompanies unexplained tragedy, where every whispered conversation might contain the key to understanding what had really happened in the neat parlor of Ivy Cottage. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself strategically in her front garden with a basket of late roses that required careful attention, observed the inspector's arrival with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose instincts about human nature were being systematically confirmed. She had spent the previous evening in careful consideration of the small domestic details that others had dismissed as irrelevant, and the pattern emerging suggested complexities that reached far deeper than anyone had yet imagined. Inspector Crispin's first discovery came from P.C. Reeves, who approached him with a particular mixture of pride and embarrassment that marked a young officer who had both succeeded and failed in the same night. The constable's vigil at Ivy Cottage had been interrupted shortly after 2 o'clock by the sound of someone attempting to force entry through the scullery window, and though his pursuit had been unsuccessful, he had managed to secure a piece of evidence that proved immediately significant. "A woman's glove, sir," Reeves reported, producing a small envelope with careful ceremony. "Fine black kid, with the initial M worked in silk thread on the wrist. The prowler dropped it when I surprised them at the window. Small hands, but not a child's, and they knew the garden well enough to have a bicycle waiting behind the hawthorn hedge." The glove, when examined in the clear morning light, proved to be of exceptional quality, the sort of accessory that spoke of refined taste and comfortable circumstances. More significantly, it bore the unmistakable signs of recent use, and the initial M embroidered with such care suggested a personal significance that went beyond mere fashion. Inspector Crispin found himself thinking of the elegant umbrella that had appeared so mysteriously in Mrs. Fawcett's hall, and wondering whether both objects might have belonged to the same person. Dr. Haydock's arrival with his preliminary findings transformed what had been a puzzling death into an unmistakable case of murder. The elderly physician's expression carried the particular gravity of a man who had discovered something that challenged his professional assumptions and demanded immediate action. "I've completed the initial examination," he announced without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years' medical practice. "The cause of death was not natural, Inspector. There's evidence of suffocation, possibly by chloroform or a similar substance. The sweet chemical odor was faint but unmistakable, and there are signs of congestion in the lungs that don't match a simple heart failure. More telling still, there's a slight abrasion at the corner of the mouth, consistent with a cloth being pressed firmly over the face." This revelation cast the entire investigation in a dramatically different light, confirming that Mrs. Fawcett had indeed been murdered and that her desperate screaming had been the result of a deliberate attack rather than a medical emergency. The locked room mystery now became not merely puzzling but sinister, suggesting a killer clever enough to commit murder and then create the illusion of an impossible crime. The afternoon brought Inspector Crispin to Mrs. Larkins's cottage for a more detailed interview with Miss Whitby, and it was here that the true complexity of the case began to reveal itself. The young woman received him in the parlor with a composure that seemed fragile as spun glass, her pale hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on the locket that lay between them on the small table like an accusation waiting to be answered. "It belonged to Mrs. Fawcett," Miss Whitby said quietly when asked about the locket. "She showed it to me only once, several weeks ago. She said she had kept it as a reminder of past mistakes, though she wouldn't explain what she meant. The photographs inside. One is of her as a young woman. The other is my sister Margaret." The story that emerged, drawn out with patient questioning, revealed the tragic foundation upon which the current drama had been built. Margaret Whitby had been employed in Mr. Fawcett's London offices 3 years earlier, but her relationship with her employer had gone far beyond the merely professional. She had become his mistress, a relationship conducted with such discretion that even his wife had remained unaware until circumstances made concealment impossible. Margaret was young and trusting, Miss Whitby explained, her voice growing stronger as the long-held secret finally found expression. Mr. Fawcett promised her marriage, spoke of taking her abroad where they could start fresh. She believed him completely, poor dear. She had no idea that he was already negotiating his marriage to Emmeline, arranging a union that would consolidate his business interests and provide him with the social respectability he craved. The discovery of the affair had precipitated a crisis that destroyed lives with the casual efficiency of a natural disaster. Mrs. Fawcett, confronted with evidence of her husband's betrayal, had demanded Margaret's immediate dismissal and disappearance. Mr. Fawcett, faced with the choice between his pregnant mistress and his advantageous marriage, had chosen respectability over responsibility with the cold calculation of a man accustomed to treating people as expendable resources. Margaret came, to Much Benham thinking she could appeal to his conscience, Miss Whitby continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. She was desperate, alone, carrying his child with nowhere to turn, but he wouldn't even see her. She waited by the mill stream for hours, hoping he would come, hoping he would remember what they had meant to each other. Instead, she found only rejection and despair. The official verdict had been accidental drowning, but those who knew the circumstances understood the true nature of Margaret's death. The young woman had taken her own life in the dark waters of the mill stream, driven to desperation by the callous abandonment of those who should have protected her. Mrs. Fawcett, despite her role in the tragedy, had kept Margaret's photograph and correspondence, perhaps from guilt or perhaps from a desire to maintain some form of power over the secret that had shaped her marriage. "I came to work for Mrs. Fawcett planning revenge," Miss Whitby admitted with painful honesty. "I thought she was heartless, cruel. I wanted to make her pay for what she had done to Margaret, but living in that house, seeing her daily struggles with loneliness and regret, I began to understand that she had been as much a victim as my sister. She had loved her husband completely, trusted him without reservation. The discovery of his betrayal had broken something in her that never quite healed. This revelation provided Inspector Crispin with compelling motives for murder, but it also raised new questions about the practical mechanics of the crime. Miss Whitby's emotional testimony had established her presence at Ivy Cottage and her complex feelings toward Mrs. Fawcett, but it had not explained how she could have committed murder in a locked room, or why she would have chosen such an elaborate method when simpler approaches would have been available. The discovery of anonymous letters hidden in Mrs. Fawcett's bedroom provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. The correspondence, written in an educated hand that made veiled references to justice for Margaret, and demanded that Mrs. Fawcett make proper amends for past cruelties, suggested that someone had been applying pressure to the widow in her final weeks. More disturbing still was the discovery of an empty Digitalis bottle hidden behind books on her bedroom shelf. A container that had been filled with heart medication only days before, but was now completely empty. As the investigation progressed, Miss Marple found herself drawn repeatedly to the physical details that others had overlooked in their focus on the dramatic human elements of the case. The elegant umbrella with its mother-of-pearl handle continued to puzzle her, particularly its thoroughly wet condition on a day when there had been no rain. The key ring with its length of blue wool seemed to tell its own story about Mrs. Fawcett's careful habits and the particular difficulties of the scullery door lock. When Inspector Crispin shared his findings with her over tea in her comfortable sitting room, Miss Marple listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that the most important clues were often hidden among the mundane details of domestic life, rather than in the dramatic gestures that captured everyone else's attention. "Most illuminating," she murmured, her knitting needles clicking thoughtfully as she considered the implications of the day's revelations. "Though I confess I keep thinking about that chain on Mrs. Fawcett's door, Inspector. Such a practical woman, yet she found herself unable to manage something she had done successfully every day for months. One wonders what could have made such a familiar task suddenly impossible." This observation prompted Inspector Crispin to reconsider the locked room mystery from an entirely different perspective. Instead of seeking exotic explanations for an impossible crime, perhaps the solution lay in understanding how ordinary objects and routine actions could be manipulated to create the illusion of impossibility where none actually existed. "There was a case, I remember," Miss Marple continued in her gentle way, "involving a young woman who had locked herself out of her cottage. She discovered she could manipulate the door chain from outside by using a long parasol handle inserted through the letter slot. It required considerable dexterity and intimate knowledge of the mechanism, but it could be done. Of course, such an approach would leave traces. Silk caught on rough wood, perhaps, or small scratches on the brass fittings. The implications of this suggestion sent Inspector Crispin back to Ivy Cottage with renewed purpose, where careful examination of the door chain and letter slot revealed exactly the sort of evidence Miss Marple had predicted. Tiny fragments of silk clung to the rough edges of the slot, and the brass chain showed fresh scratches consistent with manipulation by a long, thin implement. The mystery of the locked room was beginning to resolve itself into a clever but ultimately detectable deception. As evening approached, the investigation had transformed from a puzzling natural death into a complex case of premeditated murder, with multiple suspects possessing both compelling motives and potential means for the crime. The challenge now facing Inspector Crispin was to determine which of the various emotional and financial pressures had actually driven someone to kill Mrs. Fawcett, and more importantly, to identify the person clever enough to have conceived and executed such an elaborate deception. Miss Marple, reflecting on the day's discoveries from her quiet garden, found herself thinking about the ways that past sins could reach into the present, creating pressures that eventually demanded resolution through desperate actions. The truth was there among the accumulated evidence of human frailty and calculation, waiting to be recognized by someone who understood that the most carefully planned crimes often betrayed themselves through the smallest domestic details that their perpetrators had overlooked in their focus on grander deceptions. The Wednesday morning brought Inspector Crispin back to Ivy Cottage with the systematic determination of a man whose theoretical understanding required practical demonstration. Miss Marple's gentle suggestion about the umbrella and door chain had provided him with a working hypothesis, but police work demanded proof that would satisfy both magistrates and juries. The elegant umbrella with its mother-of-pearl handle lay on Mrs. Fawcett's hall table like an accusation waiting to be answered. With P.C. Reeves steadying the cottage door, Inspector Crispin carefully inserted the umbrella's curved handle through the letter slot, maneuvering it with the precise movements of someone testing a delicate mechanism. The chain, after a moment's resistance, yielded to the upward pressure and slipped into its housing with a soft click that seemed to echo through the morning air. When he withdrew the umbrella, tiny scratches on the brass fittings told their own story, and a faint residue of soap along the metal handle explained the wetness that had puzzled everyone on that rainless Saturday afternoon. "Household soap," Inspector Crispin observed with satisfaction, showing the traces to P.C. Reeves. "Used to ease the metal against metal to make the manipulation possible." Someone with intimate knowledge of this particular door chain and considerable dexterity managed to lock Mrs. Fawcett inside her own home after committing murder. Miss Marple, who had arrived at the garden gate under the perfectly reasonable pretext of returning a book that Mrs. Fawcett had lent her weeks earlier, observed the demonstration with the quiet attention of someone whose expectations were being methodically confirmed. "How very ingenious," she murmured, her knitting needles clicking thoughtfully. Though I suppose anyone who had lived in the cottage and observed Mrs. Fawcett's daily routines would understand exactly how that troublesome chain operated. The implications of this observation sent Inspector Crispin directly to Mrs. Larkins's cottage, where Irene Whitby awaited him with the pale composure of someone who had spent a sleepless night contemplating the inevitable. The black kid glove that P.C. Reeves had recovered from the midnight prowler provided the opening he needed, and Miss Whitby's immediate recognition of the elegant accessory confirmed what he had begun to suspect. "It belonged to my sister Margaret," she admitted quietly, her hands trembling as she reached for the glove. "She left it to me, along with a few other personal items. I've treasured it as one of the few reminders I had of her." Her explanation for the nocturnal visit to Ivy Cottage emerged gradually, each detail adding weight to the growing evidence of her involvement in the tragedy. "I was frightened," she continued, her voice barely audible above Mrs. Larkins's sympathetic murmuring. "After Mrs. Fawcett's death, I realized there were things in the cottage that could be misunderstood, letters and documents that might cast suspicion on innocent people. I thought if I could retrieve them quietly, without causing additional distress to anyone, it would be better for all concerned." Inspector Crispin's patient questioning revealed the true nature of these documents. Correspondence between Irene and Basil Fawcett that had begun months earlier as shared grievances against Mrs. Fawcett, but had gradually evolved into something approaching conspiracy. The letters, which Irene had attempted to burn in Mrs. Larkins's garden incinerator, spoke of mounting pressures and desperate circumstances that had driven two fundamentally decent people toward unthinkable actions. The telegram from Scotland Yard, arriving that afternoon with the efficiency of modern communications, confirmed the financial pressures that had made murder seem like Basil's only option. The Metropolitan Police had been investigating irregularities in the late Mr. Fawcett's Malayan business dealings, and they had identified Basil as a person of interest in connection with forged documents and fraudulent property transfers. Mrs. Fawcett's registered letter to the solicitors, with its urgent requests for investigation of these same properties, represented a threat that could have destroyed him completely. When confronted with this evidence at the Blue Boar, Basil's carefully maintained facade finally cracked under the weight of accumulated pressure. His confession emerged not as dramatic revelation, but as the weary admission of a man who had exhausted his capacity for deception. The forged documents, the fictitious companies, the elaborate web of financial manipulation that had seemed so clever in conception had become an unsustainable burden that grew heavier with each passing day. She was going to ruin everything, he said finally, his voice carrying the bitter tone of someone who felt himself the victim of circumstances beyond his control. The old woman had been asking questions, demanding explanations for transactions she didn't understand. She threatened to expose matters that would have destroyed not just me, but innocent investors who had trusted my father's business reputation. The practical details of the murder emerged through careful reconstruction of the events leading up to Mrs. Fawcett's death. Irene's position as companion had provided her with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Fawcett's habits and fears, while her access to the cottage made her the perfect accomplice for a crime that required inside knowledge. The murder itself had been accomplished earlier than anyone had suspected, during the afternoon when Mrs. Fawcett was expecting a social call that would arouse no suspicion from her neighbors. Dr. Haydock's examination had revealed traces of chloroform, suggesting that Mrs. Fawcett had been rendered unconscious before being suffocated with a cushion from her own settee. The tea service, with its 2 cups, told the story of a visit that had begun innocently enough but had ended in calculated murder when Mrs. Fawcett had refused to be dissuaded from her legal actions against Basil's interests. The elaborate deception that followed had been designed to create the illusion of natural death in a locked room, with Irene using the umbrella to manipulate the door chain from outside after arranging Mrs. Fawcett's body in the parlor. The screaming that had brought the village running had come not from the deceased woman, but from Irene herself, creating the impression of a woman trapped in her own home while actually providing cover for the final stages of their plan. Miss Marple, listening to Inspector Crispin's account of these revelations from her comfortable sitting room that evening, reflected on the particular tragedy of 2 people whose individual weaknesses had combined to produce something far worse than either might have accomplished alone. "It's remarkable," she observed gently, "how shared guilt can create bonds that appear to be loyalty, but are really nothing more than mutual corruption. Poor Irene, carrying the burden of her sister's death, and poor Basil, trapped by his father's legacy and his own poor choices. Together, they convinced themselves that one more wrong could somehow make everything right." The arrests, when they came the following morning, brought little satisfaction to anyone involved. Basil Fawcett and Irene Whitby were taken into custody with the quiet dignity of people who had exhausted their capacity for resistance, their conspiracy exposed through the patient accumulation of small domestic details that had seemed insignificant to everyone except Miss Marple's experienced eye. As the village began the slow process of absorbing yet another tragedy, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the ways that past sins could reach into the present, creating pressures that eventually demanded resolution through desperate actions. The truth had been there all along, hidden among the familiar objects and routine interactions of daily life, waiting to be recognized by someone who understood that the most carefully planned crimes often betrayed themselves through the smallest oversights that their perpetrators had overlooked in their focus on grander deceptions. The elegant umbrella, the soap-stained door chain, the untouched teacup, and the locket with its faded photographs had all contributed their evidence to the final understanding of what had really happened at Ivy Cottage on that fatal Saturday afternoon. Justice would take its course, but the scars left by this tragedy would remain long after the legal proceedings had concluded, a reminder that even the most peaceful villages could harbor secrets dark enough to drive ordinary people to murder. The Thursday morning that followed the arrests brought Inspector Crispin back to St. Mary Mead with the satisfied air of a man who had successfully concluded a complex investigation. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by small inconsistencies that refused to arrange themselves into the neat pattern everyone else seemed to accept. She had spent a restless night considering the timing of events, and the more she reflected on the sequence of Saturday afternoon's tragedy, the more certain details seemed to demand reconsideration. The scream that had brought the village running continued to perplex her with its particular quality of desperation. In her considerable experience with human nature under stress, people who were being murdered did not typically call out with such specific instructions. "Open the door," Mrs. Fawcett had cried, not help or murder, but a precise request that suggested she knew exactly what needed to be done to ensure her safety. It was the cry of someone who understood her danger and believed that assistance lay just beyond a mechanical obstacle. Miss Marple made her way to P.C. Reeves's cottage that morning, carrying a small basket of seed cake, as was her custom when seeking information that might prove delicate. The young constable, grateful for both the refreshment and the opportunity to discuss his role in the dramatic events, was happy to provide the precise details she requested about the timing of the rescue attempt. 4 minutes at the most, Miss Marple, he confirmed, consulting his notebook with the pride of someone who had maintained accurate records under pressure. From the first scream to when we got the door open, Mr. Quayle was there first, then Mrs. Larkins and Mr. Larch. I came up from the bottom of the lane when I heard the commotion. We all concentrated on the front door, naturally enough. Nobody thought to check the back until much later. This confirmation of the timeline strengthened Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the mechanics of the crime. 4 minutes provided ample opportunity for someone familiar with the cottage's layout to escape through the rear, while the rescue efforts focused on the chained front door. The scullery window, which had been found slightly ajar, began to assume greater significance in her mental reconstruction of events. When Inspector Crispin arrived at Ivy Cottage later that morning to complete his final examination of the scene, he found Miss Marple in the kitchen, her attention focused on the troublesome scullery door lock that Mrs. Larkins had mentioned. Her gentle persistence in examining domestic details had often proved illuminating in past investigations, and he had learned to respect her observations even when their significance was not immediately apparent. "You seem particularly interested in that lock, Miss Marple," he observed, noting her careful examination of the mechanism and the blue wool that Mrs. Fawcett had used to identify the problematic key. "It's the sort of thing that troubles me, Inspector," she replied with her characteristic mildness. Mrs. Fawcett was such a practical woman, yet she found herself unable to manage something she had done successfully every day for months. One wonders what could have made such a familiar task suddenly impossible. Her gentle questioning led them both to reconsider the physical evidence from a different perspective. The scullery window, when examined more carefully, revealed faint scratches on the sill that had not been made by a woman's jewelry, but by a flat metal tool used to ease a tight frame. There were traces of soap along the wood where someone had lubricated the mechanism to ensure silent operation, and on the flagstone below, a smear of boot polish that had collected grit despite the recent dry weather. "Most interesting," Miss Marple murmured, bending with some difficulty to examine the evidence. "It's remarkable how neat men often betray themselves through excessive attention to detail. They polish to the very edge of their boots, and it leaves telltale marks even when there's been no rain to reveal them." The implications of these discoveries sent them to examine the rear of the cottage more thoroughly, where the hawthorn hedge showed signs of recent passage and the grass verge beyond bore the faint impressions of bicycle wheels turned sharply for a quick departure. The pattern suggested someone who had entered through the scullery window, committed murder, and then escaped through the same route while the village gathered at the front door. Inspector Crispin found himself reconsidering the 3 men who had been first on the scene: Mr. Quayle, Mrs. Larkins, and Mr. Larch. Mrs. Larkins could be eliminated immediately due to her physical limitations and lack of technical knowledge. Mr. Larch, despite his awkwardness and possession of a well-maintained penknife, seemed an unlikely candidate for such a precisely executed crime. That left Mr. Quayle, whose intimate knowledge of locks, chains, and mechanical devices made him uniquely qualified for the task. The afternoon brought dramatic confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions when smoke began billowing from the village post office. The fire, discovered by Mr. Quayle himself and reported with commendable promptness, appeared to have started in the electrical system and threatened the building's records and equipment. The village responded with typical efficiency, and the blaze was quickly extinguished with minimal damage to the structure. Yet Miss Marple, observing the scene with her usual attention to detail, noted several curious inconsistencies in Mr. Quayle's appearance and behavior. His shirt cuffs were incorrectly buttoned, one fastened through the wrong hole in a manner that such a fastidious man would never normally tolerate. There was a pale rim of soap visible under one fingernail, applied with care but not entirely removed. Most tellingly, there was the faint but unmistakable scent of chloroform clinging to his clothes, partially masked by an unusually liberal application of eau de cologne. The post office ledger, which Mr. Quayle had promised to deliver to Inspector Crispin the following morning, showed signs of having been exposed to heat and smoke. When examined more closely, it became apparent that 2 pages had been carefully removed with surgical precision, eliminating any record of transactions that might have proven compromising to someone with access to the village's postal communications. Dr. Haydock's confirmation that chloroform could leave traces on clothing as well as in the victim's system provided the final piece of evidence needed to reconstruct the true sequence of events. Mr. Quayle's position as postmaster had given him advanced knowledge of Mrs. Fawcett's correspondence with her solicitors, and his access to the cottage through his friendship with the deceased had provided the opportunity he needed to prevent the exposure of secrets that would have destroyed him. The anonymous letters threatening Mrs. Fawcett, when examined more carefully, bore the distinctive characteristics of Mr. Quayle's handwriting style, particularly his habit of forming certain letters with the precise flourishes that came from years of addressing envelopes and parcels. The registered letter that Mrs. Fawcett had been so insistent about posting had contained information that would have revealed Mr. Quayle's long-standing practice of intercepting and manipulating correspondence for his own benefit. As the evidence accumulated, Inspector Crispin found himself facing the uncomfortable task of arresting a man who had been instrumental in the initial investigation and had maintained an appearance of helpful cooperation throughout the proceedings. Mr. Quayle's neat, orderly world was about to collapse under the weight of crimes that had begun with small corruptions and escalated to murder when exposure threatened his carefully maintained respectability. Miss Marple, reflecting on the case from her garden that evening, observed to Inspector Crispin that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful and cooperative. Mr. Quayle's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, she noted gently. His attention to detail and desire for order made him an excellent postmaster, but it also made him believe he could manage and control situations that were far beyond any one person's ability to direct. The poor man thought he could tidy up his crimes as efficiently as he managed his postal duties, but human nature rarely cooperates with such neat arrangements. The village would need time to absorb yet another shocking revelation about someone they had trusted implicitly for years. The investigation that had begun with Mrs. Fawcett's mysterious death in her locked parlor was finally approaching its true resolution, though the human cost of the tragedy would continue to resonate long after the legal proceedings had concluded. The Friday morning that followed brought Inspector Crispin to Miss Marple's cottage, with the methodical determination of a man who understood that theoretical evidence required practical demonstration before it could satisfy the demands of justice. The accumulated clues pointing toward Mr. Quayle's guilt were compelling, yet the inspector's experience had taught him that even the most convincing circumstantial case could crumble under the pressure of a skilled defense unless supported by irrefutable proof of capability and intent. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose patient observations were finally approaching their logical conclusion. She had spent a restless night considering the human elements that transformed ordinary postal fraud into desperate murder, and her gentle questioning soon revealed that Inspector Crispin shared her concerns about the psychological pressures that had driven a respected community figure to such extremes. "The difficulty," she observed, while arranging her knitting with characteristic precision, "is that Mr. Quayle has had several days to compose himself and prepare explanations for any evidence we might present. A direct confrontation will simply allow him to retreat behind the sort of careful denials that have served him well for 30 years. What we require is a demonstration that will reveal his knowledge of techniques that only the actual murderer could possess." The trap they devised together was elegantly simple in its conception, relying on the fundamental principle that guilty knowledge betrays itself through unconscious familiarity with incriminating details. Miss Marple would invite Mr. Quayle for afternoon tea under the perfectly reasonable pretext of seeking advice about postal regulations, while Inspector Crispin observed from concealment. The elegant umbrella with its mother-of-pearl handle would be prominently displayed, along with other items that should provoke revealing reactions from someone who had used them to commit murder. At precisely 3 o'clock, Mr. Quayle arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with a punctuality that had made him such a reliable figure in village affairs. His appearance was immaculate, as always, yet Miss Marple's experienced eye immediately noted the small signs of strain that no amount of careful grooming could entirely conceal. His left cuff was incorrectly buttoned, a detail so uncharacteristic that it spoke volumes about his state of mind, and there was a faint but unmistakable scent of cologne applied with unusual liberality, as if to mask some other odor that might prove compromising. The conversation began with the sort of mundane pleasantries that characterized village social interactions, but Miss Marple gradually introduced elements designed to test her guests' reactions to specific details of the crime. When she mentioned the troublesome door chain at Ivy Cottage and wondered aloud about methods for manipulating such mechanisms, Mr. Quayle's response was immediate and telling. "The proper technique," he said with unconscious authority, "requires a thin, flat implement with sufficient length to reach the mechanism and enough strength to lift the weight of the chain. A lady's umbrella handle, properly employed, could accomplish the task quite effectively, though it would require considerable dexterity and intimate knowledge of the particular mechanism involved." The words were spoken with the confidence of someone describing a familiar procedure, and the specific technical details revealed knowledge that could only have been gained through practical experience. Miss Marple's gentle request that he demonstrate the technique using her own door chain provided the final confirmation of his guilt, as Mr. Quayle manipulated the umbrella with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same action under considerably more desperate circumstances. Inspector Crispin's emergence from his place of concealment brought an end to the charade with quiet dignity rather than dramatic confrontation. Mr. Quayle's reaction was neither surprise nor denial, but rather the weary resignation of a man who had always known that his carefully constructed deceptions would eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The confession that followed revealed the full scope of a corruption that had begun with small conveniences and had gradually evolved into systematic fraud. Mr. Quayle's position as postmaster had provided him with access to correspondence that revealed the private business affairs of everyone in the district, and he had used this knowledge to his advantage in ways both subtle and profitable. Money orders had been delayed or misdirected when it served his purposes. Letters containing sensitive information had been opened, and their contents exploited for personal gain, and registered items had occasionally disappeared entirely when their loss benefited his schemes. Mrs. Fawcett's discovery of these irregularities had posed an existential threat to the elaborate network of deceptions that had sustained Mr. Quayle's comfortable lifestyle for decades. Her correspondence with London solicitors had revealed patterns of postal irregularities that would have triggered a comprehensive investigation, and her registered letter contained specific accusations that would have destroyed him completely. The murder had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his postal frauds, but the execution had required him to take risks that ultimately provided the evidence for his conviction. The locked room mystery had been accomplished through careful manipulation of Mrs. Fawcett's own security measures, using her elegant umbrella to operate the door chain from outside after administering chloroform through the scullery window. The screaming that had brought the village running had been his own voice, disguised by distance and acoustics, to create the impression of a woman trapped in her own home and calling desperately for assistance that would arrive too late to save her life. As the full implications of Mr. Quayle's betrayal became apparent to the assembled villagers, Miss Marple observed the particular sadness that accompanies the exposure of trusted figures whose corruption has violated the fundamental bonds of community life. The postmaster's systematic abuse of his position had touched virtually every household in St. Mary Mead, creating a sense of violation that would require years to heal completely. The investigation that had begun with Mrs. Fawcett's mysterious death in her locked parlor had revealed truths about human nature that extended far beyond a single murder. The village would need time to rebuild the trust that had been so thoroughly shattered, and the scars left by this betrayal would serve as a permanent reminder that even the most peaceful communities could harbor secrets dark enough to drive ordinary people to extraordinary crimes. Miss Marple, reflecting on the case as evening settled over the village, found herself thinking about the curious ways that justice sometimes emerged from tragedy, and wondering whether the community would ultimately prove stronger for having confronted the darkness that had hidden among them for so long. The truth had been revealed, and justice would be served, but the human cost of betrayed trust would remain long after the legal proceedings had reached their conclusion. The Saturday evening that followed Mr. Quayle's demonstration brought Inspector Crispin back to Miss Marple's sitting room with the weary satisfaction of a man whose patient investigation had finally yielded its secrets. The village had spent the day in that particular state of suspended animation that follows dramatic revelations, with conversations conducted in hushed tones and meaningful glances exchanged over garden gates. Miss Marple, who had requested the presence of Dr. Haydock and P.C. Reeves for what she termed a final clarification of details, arranged her knitting with the deliberate precision of someone preparing to untangle the last knots of a complex pattern. "I believe," she began with characteristic gentleness, "that we have been looking at this tragedy from entirely the correct angle, though perhaps we have not seen all the connections as clearly as we might." Mr. Quayle's confession was quite accurate in its essential details, but I suspect there are one or two small points that deserve our attention before we consider the matter completely resolved. Inspector Crispin settled himself in the comfortable chair by the window, noting that Miss Marple had arranged several items on the small table beside her. The elegant umbrella with its mother-of-pearl handle, a length of household soap, and a small notebook filled with her precise handwriting. The deliberate staging suggested that she had prepared what he had come to recognize as one of her methodical explanations, the sort that invariably revealed connections that had escaped more official investigations. "The beauty of Mr. Quayle's crime," Miss Marple continued, her needles clicking softly, "lay not in its complexity, but in its elegant simplicity. He understood, as all successful criminals must, that the most convincing deceptions are built upon foundations of truth. Mrs. Fawcett was indeed trapped behind her own door, calling desperately for assistance that arrived precisely when he intended it should." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest. "But the timing, Miss Marple. The chloroform traces, the condition of the body when we found her. Exactly as they should have been, Doctor, for a woman who had been murdered approximately 20 minutes before we broke down her door." Miss Marple's eyes held that particular brightness that indicated she was approaching the heart of the matter. Mr. Quayle's understanding of village routines was quite perfect. He knew that Mrs. Fawcett would be alone on Saturday afternoon, that she was expecting no visitors, and that her habits of security would work to his advantage rather than against it. The explanation that followed revealed the crime's true elegance through Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable logic. Mr. Quayle had indeed entered through the scullery window, using his intimate knowledge of the cottage's layout and Mrs. Fawcett's habits to approach his victim without arousing suspicion. The chloroform, purchased with the perfectly reasonable explanation of cleaning postal equipment, had rendered Mrs. Fawcett unconscious within moments of his arrival. "The suffocation followed immediately," Miss Marple explained with clinical precision. "Mr. Quayle could not risk Mrs. Fawcett regaining consciousness and identifying her attacker. He used a cushion from her own settee, applied with just enough pressure to ensure death, but not enough to leave obvious marks of violence. Then came the truly clever part of his plan. She lifted the umbrella with careful fingers, demonstrating the technique that had created the locked room mystery. The curved handle, when inserted through the letter slot, with the aid of household soap to ease its passage, could indeed manipulate the door chain from outside. The scratches on the brass fittings told their own story, as did the faint residue of soap that had made the impossible seem routine. "But the scream, Miss Marple," P.C. Reeves interjected with the earnestness of a young man seeking to understand every detail. Half the village heard Mrs. Fawcett calling for help. Miss Marple's smile held both sadness and admiration for human ingenuity, however misdirected. That, my dear constable, was perhaps Mr. Quayle's most audacious deception. The scream you heard was not Mrs. Fawcett's voice at all. It was Mr. Quayle himself, calling out in a tone pitched high enough to suggest feminine distress, using words that would bring immediate assistance while creating the perfect alibi for his own presence at the scene. The implications of this revelation settled over the room like a chill. Inspector Crispin found himself reconsidering every detail of that afternoon, seeing how perfectly Mr. Quayle had orchestrated not just the murder, but the discovery of the crime. The postmaster had been among the first to arrive, had participated actively in the rescue attempts, and had demonstrated exactly the sort of helpful cooperation that deflected suspicion while establishing his apparent innocence. The anonymous letters threatening Mrs. Fawcett were his work as well, Miss Marple continued, consulting her notebook. Written in a disguised hand, but betraying his characteristic precision in letter formation. He hoped to frighten her into abandoning her investigation of his postal irregularities, but when that failed, he realized that more direct action would be necessary. Dr. Haydock shook his head with professional admiration tinged by horror. The man planned it like a military campaign, every detail calculated, every contingency considered. Indeed, Doctor, Mr. Quayle's greatest strength as a postmaster, his attention to detail and understanding of human nature, served him equally well as a murderer. He knew exactly how the village would respond to Mrs. Fawcett's apparent distress, and he used that knowledge to create witnesses to his own innocence. The fire at the post office, Miss Marple explained, had been the final element of Quayle's plan, designed to destroy the ledger pages that documented his years of postal fraud. The electrical sabotage had been accomplished with the same meticulous care that characterized all his actions, timed to occur when the investigation into Mrs. Fawcett's death might have led to uncomfortable questions about his professional conduct. The tragedy, Miss Marple observed as her explanation drew to its close, is that Mr. Quayle's crimes began with such small corruptions. A letter delayed here, a postal order misdirected there, information gleaned from correspondence that should have remained private. Each transgression made the next seem less significant until he found himself capable of murder to protect secrets that had grown beyond his ability to manage. Inspector Crispin rose from his chair with the decisive movement of a man whose duty was clear, however unpleasant its execution might prove. "We'll take him into custody tonight, Miss Marple. The evidence you've helped us gather should be more than sufficient for conviction." As the official party prepared to depart, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting resumed with its customary rhythm. The village would need time to absorb this final revelation, to understand that their trusted postmaster had not only betrayed their confidence in countless small ways, but had ultimately committed murder to protect his accumulated deceptions. The truth was finally complete, but Miss Marple found herself thinking of the human cost that extended far beyond Mrs. Fawcett's death. Mr. Quayle had destroyed not only a life, but the fundamental trust that held communities together, creating scars that would require years to heal completely. In her long experience with human nature, she had observed that the most devastating crimes were often those that corrupted the ordinary institutions people depended upon for their daily security and comfort. Tomorrow would bring the formal charges, the newspaper reports, and the beginning of legal proceedings that would dissect every detail of the tragedy for public consumption. But tonight, as St. Mary Mead settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple reflected on the curious ways that justice sometimes emerged from careful observation of the smallest domestic details, and wondered whether the village would ultimately prove stronger for having confronted the darkness that had hidden among them for so long. The Sunday morning that followed brought Inspector Crispin to the neat quarters above the post office, where he found Lionel Quayle methodically burning papers in the small grate while his untouched breakfast grew cold beside him. The postmaster looked up from his task with neither surprise nor resistance, as if he had been expecting this moment since Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable demonstration had revealed the fatal flaw in his carefully constructed deception. "Inspector," Quayle said with the same courteous formality that had characterized his professional dealings for 30 years. "I assume Miss Marple has explained the technical aspects of the matter to your satisfaction. She always was remarkably observant about domestic details that others overlooked." His hands, which had been feeding documents to the flames with mechanical precision, stilled as he spoke, and there was something almost like relief in his voice as he set aside the poker and straightened his cuffs with characteristic attention to detail. The confession that followed was delivered with the methodical accuracy that had made Quayle such an efficient postmaster, each detail recorded with clinical precision as he described the elaborate deception that had transformed murder into an apparent impossibility. He spoke of Mrs. Fawcett's discovery of his postal irregularities, the urgent registered letter that would have exposed 30 years of careful financial manipulation, and the desperate calculation that had led him to believe murder offered his only escape from inevitable ruin. "It began during the difficult years after the war," he explained as Inspector Crispin took careful notes. "Postal workers' salaries had not kept pace with rising costs, and there were family obligations that required creative solutions, a delayed money order here, a misdirected postal draft there. Small amounts that seemed hardly significant at the time, but which accumulated into something far more substantial over the years." The scope of Quayle's systematic corruption gradually became clear as Inspector Crispin examined the partially burned documents and cross-referenced them with postal records from Much Benham. The crimes had touched virtually every household in St. Mary Mead, creating a network of financial manipulation so sophisticated and long-standing that its exposure would have destroyed not only Quayle's reputation, but the fundamental trust that held the community together. News of the arrest traveled through the village with the particular speed that accompanies shocking revelations in small communities. By evening, every household had absorbed the basic facts, and by Monday morning, the full implications had begun to settle into the collective consciousness with the weight of a profound betrayal. The post office remained closed, its familiar routine suspended indefinitely while arrangements were made for temporary management and a comprehensive audit of decades of transactions. Miss Marple, observing the village's response from her garden gate, noted the particular way that communities absorb such revelations. There was anger, certainly, as people calculated the extent to which their private correspondence had been violated and their financial affairs manipulated. There was embarrassment as they recalled the many times they had confided sensitive information to someone they had trusted implicitly. But there was also a gradual recognition that they had been victims of someone whose corruption had been so systematic and well concealed that no reasonable person could have been expected to detect it. The Sunday service that followed brought an unusually large congregation to St. Mary Mead's ancient church, as if the community sought collective comfort in familiar rituals, after having their fundamental assumptions about trust and security so thoroughly shattered. The vicar's sermon on forgiveness and redemption seemed particularly relevant, though Miss Marple observed that several parishioners appeared to be struggling with the practical application of such elevated concepts to their current circumstances. Irene Whitby, pale but composed, sat with Mrs. Larkins in their customary pew, her presence serving as a reminder that the investigation had revealed multiple layers of deception and betrayal. Her own involvement in the conspiracy against Mrs. Fawcett had been exposed during the broader inquiry, though her cooperation with the authorities and her genuine grief over the murder had earned her a measure of sympathy from the community she had attempted to deceive. "I shall be leaving for Bath next week," she confided to Miss Marple after the service, her voice carrying the tentative hope of someone who had been offered an unexpected second chance. "Mrs. Larkins has been kind enough to provide a reference, and Dr. Haydock has written to a respectable dispensary where steady hands are valued more than social connections. I think it will be good for me to be somewhere that no one knows which umbrella I carry." Basil Fawcett had departed for London immediately, after his release from the murder charges, though Inspector Crispin's investigation had revealed financial irregularities in his father's business dealings that would require their own legal resolution. His brief note to the vicar expressed regret for the pain his actions had caused, while offering no specific apologies to those he had wronged. The inheritance from his stepmother's estate, probated according to its original terms, would provide little comfort during the proceedings that awaited him in connection with the fraudulent Malayan property transfers. As the weeks passed and the village gradually adjusted to its new circumstances, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the particular tragedy of institutions corrupted from within by those entrusted with their operation. The post office had been more than a place of business. It had been a center of community life where people gathered to exchange news, conduct essential transactions, and maintain the connections that bound them together as neighbors. Quayle's betrayal had violated not just individual privacy, but the collective trust that made such communities possible. Yet she also found reason for cautious optimism in the community's response to these revelations. The village had rallied around the victims of Quayle's schemes, offering practical assistance and emotional support to those whose savings had been stolen or whose private correspondence had been violated. Mrs. Larkins had opened her home to Irene despite learning of the young woman's role in the conspiracy, demonstrating the sort of Christian charity that transcended individual grievances. On a crisp October morning, as Miss Marple tended her garden and watched the new postmaster from Much Benham learning the routines that Quayle had managed with such deceptive efficiency, she reflected that communities, like individuals, possessed remarkable capacity for recovery from even the most devastating betrayals. The village would survive this tragedy as it had survived others throughout its long history, perhaps emerging stronger for having confronted the darkness that had hidden among them for so long. The truth had been revealed through careful attention to the smallest domestic details, an elegant umbrella, a troublesome door chain, the particular quality of a desperate scream. Justice would be served through the patient accumulation of evidence that proved guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But the real resolution lay in the community's gradual recognition that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt through the daily practice of honesty, kindness, and the sort of careful observation that noticed both human frailty and human resilience. As she settled into her comfortable chair with her knitting and the morning paper, Miss Marple smiled at the familiar sound of bicycle bells and cheerful greetings that marked the village's return to its customary rhythms. The case of the widow who screamed at her own locked door had revealed profound truths about human nature's capacity for both corruption and redemption, reminding her once again that the most important mysteries were often solved not through dramatic revelation, but through patient understanding of the small, persistent details that revealed the human heart in all its complexity. St. Mary Mead would continue its peaceful existence, a little sadder perhaps, but also a little wiser, which was as much as one could ask of any place where human beings lived together and told themselves they were safe. The weeks that followed Lionel Quayle's arrest brought Inspector Crispin back to Miss Marple's cottage with the methodical satisfaction of a man whose investigation had finally yielded its most crucial evidence. The village had begun to absorb the shock of their postmaster's betrayal, though conversations still carried the particular weight that accompanies the exposure of long-held secrets. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room, where the afternoon light illuminated a small collection of items arranged on her table with characteristic precision. The final piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple, Inspector Crispin announced, producing a small envelope that contained 2 delicate fragments of blue silk. The thread we found caught in Mrs. Fawcett's letter slot has been matched to the torn silk loop we discovered in Quayle's drawer. The laboratory confirms they're from the same piece of fabric, torn at precisely the point where the umbrella handle would have created the most stress during manipulation of the door chain. Miss Marple examined the evidence with gentle fingers, her expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone whose careful observations had been vindicated by scientific analysis. "How very thorough modern methods have become," she murmured. "Though I confess I've always found that the most important evidence lies not in what laboratories can prove, but in what human nature inevitably reveals about itself under pressure." The conversation that followed revealed the final details of Quayle's systematic deceptions, as Inspector Crispin shared the results of the comprehensive audit that had occupied several investigators for weeks. The scope of the postal fraud was staggering in its duration and sophistication, affecting not only St. Mary Mead but several neighboring villages where Quayle's careful manipulations had gone undetected for decades. Money orders had been delayed and diverted. Registered letters had disappeared entirely, and private correspondence had been opened and exploited with a regularity that spoke to years of practiced violation of trust. "The tragedy," Miss Marple observed, "is that Mr. Quayle's original crimes were relatively minor infractions that might have been forgiven if confessed before they escalated to murder. A few pounds here and there, some delayed correspondence, serious violations certainly, but hardly capital offences. It was his determination to preserve respectability at any cost that transformed manageable problems into an unsolvable crisis." Dr. Haydock's arrival with additional medical findings provided another piece of the evidentiary puzzle. His more detailed examination had revealed traces of chloroform not only in Mrs. Fawcett's system but also on fabric samples taken from Quayle's clothing, confirming the method of murder and linking the postmaster directly to the crime scene. The chemical residue, partially masked by an unusually heavy application of cologne, had persisted despite Quayle's attempts to eliminate all physical evidence of his involvement. As the afternoon progressed, Inspector Crispin shared news that brought unexpected resolution to one of the case's more poignant elements. Hidden in Mrs. Fawcett's sewing basket, beneath a false bottom secured with the same blue wool that had marked her troublesome key, they had discovered a sealed envelope addressed to Irene Whitby. The letter contained a formal apology for past harshness and notification of a small bequest intended as acknowledgement of wrongs that could not be undone but might at least be recognized. "She meant to make amends," Miss Marple said softly when shown the letter. Poor Emmeline had been carrying the burden of her choices for 3 years, knowing that her response to her husband's betrayal had contributed to a young woman's despair. The letter was her attempt to provide some measure of justice, even if it came too late to heal the deeper wounds. The village's gradual adjustment to these revelations demonstrated the particular resilience that characterized small communities faced with fundamental challenges to their assumptions about trust and security. The temporary postmaster from Much Benham had proven surprisingly capable, though his unfamiliarity with local customs created minor disruptions that served as daily reminders of the changes that Quayle's crimes had necessitated. People approached their postal business with a new wariness, their conversations more guarded, their assumptions about privacy forever altered by the knowledge of how thoroughly their communications had been violated. Yet Miss Marple also observed encouraging signs of communal healing. Mrs. Bantry had organized assistance for families most severely affected by the financial fraud, and the response had grown steadily as initial hesitation gave way to recognition that mutual support offered the best path forward. The village was learning to rebuild trust through small acts of transparency and kindness, understanding that institutions corrupted by individuals could be restored through collective commitment to higher standards. The inquest, scheduled for the following week, would provide the formal legal conclusion to Mrs. Fawcett's murder But Miss Marple understood that the real resolution lay in the community's gradual recognition that betrayal by trusted figures, however devastating, need not destroy the foundations of civilized life. The case had revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature's capacity for corruption, but it had also demonstrated the persistent power of careful observation, patient investigation, and the sort of quiet courage that chose truth over comfortable illusion. As Inspector Crispin prepared to leave, carrying with him the final pieces of evidence that would ensure Quayle's conviction, Miss Marple reflected on the curious ways that justice emerged from the patient accumulations of small details. The elegant umbrella with its torn silk loop, the troublesome door chain with its telltale scratches, the quality of a desperate scream that had revealed theatrical deception. Each element had contributed to understanding how an impossible crime had been made to seem routine through the application of intimate knowledge and careful planning. The case of the widow who screamed at her own locked door was approaching its formal conclusion, but Miss Marple knew that its true significance lay not in the punishment of a single criminal, but in the demonstration that truth, however deeply buried beneath layers of deception, could always be recovered through the methodical application of human understanding to the evidence that human nature inevitably left behind. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation between justice and deception, but tonight the village rested in the knowledge that their faith in the possibility of truth had been vindicated by patient observation and careful reasoning. The inquest that followed was held in the parish hall of St. Mary Mead itself, a decision that reflected the intimate nature of village justice and the community's need to witness the formal resolution of events that had shattered their fundamental assumptions about trust and security. The small hall, with its familiar smell of beeswax and worn wood, filled with virtually every resident capable of attending, their faces bearing the particular gravity that accompanies the exposure of long-held deceptions among neighbors who had believed themselves safe from such betrayals. Miss Marple, when asked by Inspector Crispin whether she would attend to give testimony, declined with characteristic gentleness. "I believe I've heard the essential part already," she said, settling more comfortably into her chair with her knitting. "To listen again, in official language and under oath, would not add to knowledge so much as it would add to fatigue. Besides, you have all the evidence you require, Inspector. The truth has already revealed itself to those who were patient enough to observe it properly." The proceedings themselves unfolded with the methodical efficiency that marked all of Inspector Crispin's work. Dr. Haydock's medical testimony established beyond doubt that Mrs. Fawcett had died from chloroform poisoning followed by suffocation, eliminating any possibility of natural causes. The physical evidence told its story with scientific precision. The elegant umbrella with its torn silk loop, the soap, residue on the door chain, the scratches on the brass fittings that revealed mechanical manipulation from outside the locked room. When Lionel Quayle was called upon to respond to the charges, his carefully maintained composure finally cracked under the weight of irrefutable evidence. The confession that emerged was delivered with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his postal work for 30 years, each element of the crime described with clinical accuracy as he explained how desperation had driven him to transform familiar tools of domesticity into instruments of murder. "It began so simply," he said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man who had exhausted his capacity for deception. "A delayed money order here, a misdirected letter there. Small conveniences that seemed hardly significant at the time, but which accumulated into something far more substantial over the years. Mrs. Fawcett's investigation would have exposed not just recent irregularities, but decades of careful manipulation that had touched every household in the village." The verdict of willful murder surprised no one, though its formal pronouncement seemed to settle something in the community's collective consciousness. Justice had been served through patient investigation and careful reasoning. demonstrating that truth could emerge from even the most carefully constructed deceptions when subjected to methodical examination by those who understood human nature in all its complexity. The weeks that followed brought gradual healing to St. Mary Mead, though the village would never quite return to its previous state of innocent trust in the institutions that governed daily life. The new postmaster, a careful young man whose methods were transparent to the point of occasional inconvenience, slowly won acceptance through patient demonstration that postal services could be conducted with both efficiency and integrity. People approached their correspondence with new awareness of its value and vulnerability, but they also learned that privacy could be protected through vigilance rather than abandoned through despair. Mrs. Bantry, with her characteristic organizational efficiency, established a permanent committee to assist families affected by Quayle's financial manipulations. The response grew steadily as initial hesitation gave way to recognition that mutual support offered the best path forward from betrayal. The village was learning to rebuild trust through small acts of transparency and kindness, understanding that institutions corrupted by individuals could be restored through collective commitment to higher standards. Irene Whitby's departure for Bath brought its own measure of closure to the tragedy. Her final visit to Miss Marple carried the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to distinguish between guilt that taught useful lessons and guilt that merely punished human frailty. Mrs. Fawcett's posthumous letter of apology and small bequest had provided not absolution, but acknowledgement that wrongs could be recognized even when they could not be entirely undone. "It doesn't make anything right," Irene had said, holding the letter with careful hands, "but it keeps the wrong from being everything." "Indeed," Miss Marple had replied gently, "and most of life is exactly that, keeping the wrong from swallowing the rest." Basil Fawcett remained in London, where legal proceedings concerning his father's fraudulent Malayan business dealings would occupy him for considerable time. His brief contribution to the parish fund for Quayle's victims was neither large nor sufficient to balance any account that truly mattered. But it was not nothing, and some people thought better of him for it, in the way that communities do when they are ready to extend qualified forgiveness to those who make even modest gestures toward redemption. As autumn deepened into winter, Miss Marple often reflected on the case while tending her garden or working at her knitting by the fire. The mystery of the widow who screamed at her own locked door had revealed profound truths about human nature's capacity for both deception and detection, demonstrating once again that the most important clues were often hidden among the mundane details of domestic life, rather than in dramatic gestures that captured public attention. She remembered Emmeline at the fete, neat as a pin, pinning ribbons to jam jars with hands that trembled only slightly. Remembered Irene's thin face when kindness surprised it. Remembered Lionel Quayle's immaculate cuffs and the pale line of soap he had not quite managed to remove. Human nature arranged itself before her like a familiar pattern in different fabric. The same essential design with small variations in color and weave. The springs that set people in motion remaining constant and comprehensible to those who paid careful attention to the small clicks and catches as they moved. The elegant umbrella, the troublesome door chain, the untouched teacup, and the locket with its faded photographs had all contributed their evidence to the final understanding of what had really happened at Ivy Cottage. These ordinary objects, taken out of their proper uses and transformed by human ingenuity into instruments of both crime and justice, reminded her that wickedness often borrowed decent tools because it possessed none of its own. On a quiet December evening, as the first snow began to fall over the peaceful village, Miss Marple settled into her comfortable chair with her knitting, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that truth had prevailed through the methodical application of reason to evidence that human nature inevitably left behind. St. Mary Mead would continue its existence, sadder perhaps, but also wiser, which was as much as one could ask of any place where human beings lived together and told themselves they were safe. The case was closed, but its lessons would endure in the community's memory, serving as a reminder that the price of peace was eternal vigilance, and that the most effective protection against deception lay not in suspicion of others, but in careful attention to the small details that revealed truth to those patient enough to observe and understand them. Tomorrow would bring talk of a new tea at the vicarage, and Mrs. Weatherby would recommend a recipe for seed cake that refused to behave properly, and someone would remark that the new postmaster was fearfully hard of hearing, and what a blessing, in a way, that could be. In villages, even after murder, one had tea at the proper time. And if one was wise, Miss Marple reflected as she put the kettle on, one noticed how very often it boiled at precisely the right moment for comfort. Human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, remained as predictable as the evening ritual of tea, and therein lay both its danger and its ultimate redemption.